David, you want to read like 5 or 6 lines from this poem, and then Ambrose, you can say more now that we'll have the text sort of in our ears.
Sure, I'll just start.
Can you see it?
Yep. Okay. You were a ukulele beyond my microphone. You were a Yukon beyond my Micronesia. You were a union beyond my meiosis. You were a unicycle beyond my migration. You were a universe beyond my mitochondria. You were a Eucharist beyond my Miles Davis.
So, Ambrose, I guess I'm inviting you to say what you just said now that we've heard that, the way that works. I think a lot of people will understand, given that reading that David just did. What's happening there?
Yeah, I mean, in some of these, we can see relationships a little clearer, and in others we can't. But even taking that first line, "You are a ukulele beyond my microphone," that to me is thinking about, like, okay, if we're the ukulele and the microphone are two separate things, but the song is when the microphone and the music come together.
Yeah.
What I would say is that the reason why I wanted to kind of focus on what do we mean by all these words? Like, what do we mean when we say, oh, that this makes us more human?
Yes.
Or the poets are doing this kind of project, and the philosophers are doing this other kind of project.
Right.
Whereas I think, like, from Wittgenstein and other philosophers of the later half of the 20th century, the relationship between the self, the relation, the very, like, capacity for relation, and love, and the work that language does for all of us. It allows us to take what's inside our private brain and put it out into the world and see what happens.
Yes.
And so philosophy that is not interrogating language, I would say, is a not very helpful philosophy.
Yes. Amen. Although, pre-20th century philosophy didn't do that, which
Right,
is why
exactly.
language
There was
philosophy is
a
so important.
split.
To me, this is a poem about pronouns, you and me, or you and my, right? And you is one of those really hard pronouns. You can say you, Y-O-U, all you want, and you're really not going to narrow it down, because you is one of those, like, what do you mean? You, who, what? You can actually refer to me. You like to go fishing. Then you go fishing, and then you get out your worm and you put it on your hook. And now I'm talking about me. You is very flexible, and the brilliance of Annie Litt is that what she does is she takes you sounds and she runs you through a dictionary, so that you becomes not that kind of flat you that you can easily forget about and stop thinking deeply about pronouns, right? You can actually just sort of say, well, you is so complicated, it's just randomly in the dictionary. And then you get to me, which is maybe even more complicated. So this is what's so great about the poem. You are a Eucharist beyond my Miles Davis. The basic structure of that is a kind of sweet little love line, like you are my, you are the apple of my eye, I guess is where it's from, or something like that. And yet she's doing something so multiplicitous. Do you want to say something, and then Davey something, and then we're going to go to the phone, and then we'll ask Jake and Erica to say stuff in response to the person on the phone. Do you want to say something more?
Yeah, maybe just really briefly. I was thinking about that you and the power of that you starting every line. And when we talk about this idea of interpolation, or like calling, once you cast that you out, you name a subject and you bring them into relationship with you. And part of what I think Harriet Mullen is trying to tease out is how how we're seeing others and how we're calling them into relation with ourselves, and the power of naming, and that any of these names are various, and they simultaneously, because of their compounded nature, they start to mean nothing, but at the same time they can't mean nothing. You can't get away from the history of those words.
Look at us talking about it.
Yeah. So yeah, but I want to toss it over to
This Amber Rose led a really wonderful class on the language poets earlier this week, and I was really enjoying the thought of considering the language poets as being interested in thinking through relation, and I think that Mullen is someone who's doing that pretty differently from the way that some other folks are. And so I went back to the language book, which Charles Bernstein and Bruce Andrews published in 1984, and I'm just going to read a sentence from the introduction that Andrews and Bernstein write to be able to think through this question of relation, which is, "It is our sense that the project of poetry does not involve turning language into a commodity for consumption. Instead, it involves repossessing the sign through close attention to and active participation in its production." And so one form of relation that I think about with the language poets is reconsidering the relation between language and practitioner of language, whether that's the reader or whether that's the poet, or whether that's the reader and the poet together, trying to think about our being in relation to language always, and that relation being really loud in the room, as opposed to being anxious about the way that, in Bernstein's words, a capitalist social order reproduces itself because we're, by using language that we're not really thinking about. We just reproduce the words. And if we're not thinking about those words, then somebody else is. And so thinking about our being in relation to one another is necessarily addressed by thinking about the way that we're always in relation to language, and using language to try to describe that relation, to do that meta-discursive project, is where language poetry locates itself.
Yes. There it is. There it is. Something Jason said, something Allie said before she had to go, Amber Rose and Davy just now. A version of what I was saying before, you take the modernist project and you think about a critique of capitalism, which the modernist project didn't really do, because the politics of some of the modernists was all over the place, and who knows what Williams was thinking, and Stein, oh my God. You add to this kind of language-focused philosophy, which is another way of talking about the New Left theory of the 60s. And you get this generation of people who came of age in the 60s and who start to formulate in the early 70s this kind of language focus, a linguistic critique of capitalism, if you put it in some. Yeah.